Hey everybody, so I am back today and I'm just doing a follow-up video in this sort of two-part series on why I like the games I like, and this would be the history prong of the side of the fork of the games that I play, and that is the number one historical game that I like to play is Musket and Tomahawks. And this one will be broken up similar to the Warhammer one in that I'm going to talk about background models and the game itself, but it's going to be a little bit different in that I'll be spending more time talking about the game and a little less time talking about the models, and I'll talk about why. But to start, I would just say one of the reasons why I really like Musket and Tomahawks is that it takes place in the Black Powder era, and I'm from Long Island, New York, and that's where I was born and raised. I did leave there quite a while ago, but that's where I went to school, and I'd mentioned that growing up, we had a social studies program, which was sort of like history and learning about the world for kids. I'm guessing a lot of it was 7th and 8th grade, but some of it in elementary school as well. And being in the Long Island area, you learned a lot about the Algonquin nations, the Iroquois, and that was always interesting for me. And then as well, if you know a little bit about the American War of Independence, you'll know that there were a lot of key battles and aspects that took place on Long Island as well. And so historically, it definitely had a lot of exposure to a lot of these events in that area. So there's a bit of a connection there for me as well. I'm a big fan of The Last Mohicans movie, and I actually have the DVD right there in the background just showing it. And so for inspiration, when I saw that movie, I thought it was really cool. It just sort of refueled my interest in the era. And then as well, when getting into Musket and Tomahawks, I actually got Crucible of War. You can't see it very well, but it's just a thick book that's over there, and it's a history book, and it's about the basically the French and Indian War. Now, Musket and Tomahawks actually covers a number of conflicts, but one of the main ones that it covers is the French and Indian War, and my reason for getting into Musket and Tomahawks is primarily about the French and Indian War, not the American War of Independence or the American Revolutionary War, depending on where you are in the world. I'm going to focus on the French and Indian War as far as talking about the background and why I like the game, because that's really what drew me to it, that particular conflict. So really, the background for Musket and Tomahawks, if you play the French and Indian War setting, it's a really, in many respects, underappreciated period in history, because it directly precedes the American War of Independence, which is really a dramatic, culmination of a lot of things that had happened. And so what I would say is that the French and Indian War in that period of time, and a lot of people will call it the 7 Years' War, because of actual conflicts that happened in other areas in the world at the same time. The conflicts in North America, New France, were just a part of that, although a major part of it. It really determined to some degree, to a very large degree, as to whether North America was going to be primarily inhabited by the French or the English in future generations. And so I think that that's actually a really big deal, but then historically, but then as well, it directly preceded the American War of Independence, and from what I have read, basically the political climate and the relationships between Britain and the American colonies, to a big degree, were forged during the French and Indian War, and that sort of relationship led to the American War of Independence. And so it's a really important part of history. And so I would say that in of itself, from a historical sense, I think makes it sort of an underappreciated time. Now, the warfare itself was black powder, and I've alluded to this before when I first talk about Musket and Tomahawks, and I really like the black powder era. People could talk about other conflicts in the world and other gaming genres that utilize black powder and think of it the same way, but really there's that technological tension that's happening where gunpowder and essentially gunpowder projectile weaponry, muskets, rifles, etc., are just coming into their own, but they're not perfect yet. And so the old guard, the cavalry and the tried and true sort of methods of the past they're at their peak, and they're still quite relevant. And so this is a game where, you can utilize the technology of gunpowder, and it's quite dangerous, but it still has a lot of fallbacks, and within the game, the accuracy or the inaccuracy of gunpowder is there, and the time to reload and all of that. And so, so it creates an interesting change for me. Other games that I play at times, ranged combat is sort of king in many of the rule sets, and really you almost have to devise all your tactics around it, where here it changes things up a bit and you actually experience that tension within the game, and it allows you to build strategy around close combat and musket fire, and it just changes things up for me, which I really like. The other thing too is that the French and Indian War in particular was a big change for, in particular, the British. They were still fighting continental warfare, big battlefields, open fields, and large regiments of troops on the European continent at the time. This was guerrilla warfare, and it wasn't something that was commonplace. I'm not a military expert, so I'm not going to say it was the first time that a particular country experienced it, but the historical books that I've read have indicated that sides really weren't that prepared to fight in the woods. It wasn't the way they went out and greeted opponents in warfare at the time, and it just required a lot of different skill sets from what they emphasized with their regular troops. Now that really leads in to another aspect of this, and that is the indigenous populations, the First Nations, the natives, the Indians. I use all these words interchangeably. How you built relationships politically and utilized them militarily as allies really determined how successful you were going to be in this new world. And so that to me is a really awesome part of this, because it just adds a really fun element to the game, and all different kinds of different models, despite it being it's historical, but there's like lots of different kinds of peoples, I should say, that you can use in the game, which I think is really cool. One of the things I think, just from I'm not going to call it, I guess, an emotional attachment to the imagery of the game, is that when you see a lot of the artwork, and I'll throw some images around, like they're in the deep woods, of the frontier, and that's kind of cool for a historical game. I mean, playing within the deep woods and the mountains, if you've seen Last of Mohicans, near the waterfalls, having the skirmishes that they had in these frontiers, it almost has a fantasy element within historical, at least for me, when I look at it. When you have, let's say, natives with these really brutal clubs, like with spikes coming out of them, in the woods, and you're going and you're encountering them, and like there's an aspect of a fantasy world, because it's not the modern day warfare setting. It really isn't. It's the backwoods, and that's kind of what this takes place in. And I think, to a degree, that has a really significant appeal for me. And in a lot of ways, they were just really beautiful landscapes, because they were sort of untouched. And so I think that actually adds a really significant appeal as to the background and why I like the game. Now, moving on to models. There's a big contrast in my draw to Muskets and Tomahawks and my draw to 40K when it comes to the models. It's not that I actually don't think the model's important. For all the reasons I said, that models, bring the imagery of the background to life and make you identify with the game, it completely applies here. However, Studio Tomahawk, that produces Muskets and Tomahawks, does not directly produce any of the models for the game. And so you can choose from a number of different model lines to play your Muskets and Tomahawk games. In particular, I use Minden Miniatures and then also Warlord or Conquest, but there are several others. And it adds a lot of variety, and also, it doesn't make the focus on one particular model line, which I think is refreshing too. Like, I really love Games Workshop models, but I like to buy other companies too and look for other things. And there's some creativity in your procurement, of models, which I think is really cool. So you can really use any range you want, and it gives you lots of options in that sense. So that's really it for models. But then I think with Muskets and Tomahawks, there are a lot of aspects of the game itself that I really like. Admittedly, my other game, 40K, has a very... for me, it's a very traditional rule set. It's sort of you go, then I go, and it has a sequence of steps that I've become very, very familiar with, and it just it seems to be more commonplace in games. But Muskets and Tomahawks, although it's not completely unique in some of these things, it does have some more unique aspects and ones that I've not seen in other games and that I really like. And just to start off, I'll start off with really one of the things I really like about it, and that's the fact that it has a scenario generator. Now, it's not the only game to have this, but it has a fairly nice involved scenario generator that's optional for you to use. We typically, in my gaming group, because we're still new, like I probably have 10 plus games, maybe 15 under my belt, no more than that. And we tend to use the scenario generator every time, just because we're still... I've only played some of the scenarios once or twice, just depending. Now, it actually, is a generator that helps you, it assists you in a way for you and your opponent to set up the terrain and buildings to work with the scenarios. And so the generator itself lets you roll, and you do that. As well, weather, objectives for each side, and even several optional rules as far as side plots are produced within the scenario generator. And I think it's great if you like narrative play. It could be used, you could use it from a competitive mindset, but if you really like to generate a story in your game and you're more there to see the story unfold, then it is excellent in my opinion. Now, mechanics of the game are something that I really quite like as well. You know that I've played bolt action, and I've had battle reports on the channel, and so Muskets and Tomahawks also uses a random action mechanic, and so you don't really know who's going to go next, you or your opponent. There is a significant difference, and I can't say which one I like better. Where bolt action, you actually have dice, and it's a die for each unit in the game, and even if you have the same kind of unit, each one would get its own die, and you could choose which one you want as it comes out. In Muskets and Tomahawks, it's a card-based system, and units of different types go when their card comes up. I think you could make the argument that in some ways that represents officers and types of units that are coordinating, going at the same time, which some people might find that to be more realistic. It definitely adds a bit of strategy to the game, because different types of units actually have different numbers of actions and numbers of cards, and so they activate at different frequencies, and they get different amounts of actions each time a card comes up. So it adds a bit of strategy that I quite like. So the random action for skirmish games, most of my opponents that I've played in my local gaming groups, people do like them. It is a bit of a change and from what we typically do, and it's enjoyable, and so I like that. I'll just mention a couple of rules that I really like from Muskets and Tomahawks that keeps me engaged in the game. One of them is called hidden movement. It's for scouts and natives, and it allows you, and I've talked about it in battle reports, it allows you to take your unit and just have a token that represents that unit. And if you use this tactic to a significant degree, and that would mean let's say you gave it to at least 2 of your units, then you get a third dummy token representing the fact that your opponent's men don't exactly know where you are because you're hidden, and you could lead them a bit on wild goose chases in the woods. And so for every 2 units you have, you get 1 dummy token. So if you had 4 small scout squads, you'd actually it would seem as if you possibly had 6 that the person would have to deal with. I think that's actually really good. Another one mechanic I really like is the spotting mechanic. Sometimes I think this is built into different games differently. I mean, in some cases, it's just part of the shooting phase and some of the rules, but they have a very dedicated section on spotting. And basically, in order to shoot someone, you have to be able to see them. And the line of sight is a part of this game. But even if you can see someone with line of sight, if you're crossing different types of terrain, a certain kind of weather is in place, and then if depending on the kind of unit you are, it may end up changing your ability to spot someone or to be spotted. And I think it's excellent. I mean, on a clear day in an open field, you don't really have to worry about it. In most cases, you can see from one side of the table to the other. But once you start adding other elements into the game, and particularly one like I just mentioned, hidden movement. If a unit is designated as hidden, it reduces your chance to spot them. And so it could make it so you can actually sneak up on people, used a bit more reconnaissance and things like that. And I think it's actually a really neat part of the game. Another aspect of the game that I find very different to other games I play is that most of the rules are focused around the model and not the unit. So even though you do move around in units, so this is a unit right here of grenadiers I have here in front of me, I could opt to have the front line of this unit of grenadiers fire on the natives in the woods and hold off from having the back line fire. And what that would do is it would make it that the following action, so regulars usually get 2 actions at a time when they fire. So if I do that with the first action, then in the following action, I could reload the first line and actually fire the second line. Now, that actually not only mimics what firing lines have done historically in certain times in history, but I could even, in this game, I could actually split off my firing and have one group actually firing at some here and one firing at some here. I could actually have some moving and others firing. And so essentially your officer could employ some tactics within the unit. It's not just this unit fires at that unit and that's it, like that's the only option. You have a number of action types that you're allowed to do, and for the most part you're able to split up those actions, and even when you're basically firing at models and they're in cover and things, instead of having a unit that's, let's say, partially in cover and they get the cover bonus depending on whether it's 50% like in some games, in this one it's all based on the model. And so if you're firing at a model in cover, it gets the cover bonus, but you have to split. And it can take a little longer in some cases. It's still a fast game, but you do have to split off the dice that are going to the guys that are not in cover and they don't get the bonus. And so the philosophy is very different in that the rules apply to the model, not to the unit, in most cases. And I think that's interesting. It's different. I'm not saying it's better, but I actually like it as a difference, just to have that as a difference. Another, I guess the last aspect of the game mechanics that I'll just mention off the top of my head that I quite like is just your ability to create individualized officers. You can select several traits, and some of them being traits that are known for the type of soldier they are. So like, when you use regulars, you can actually get a trait called military tactician, and it's a very good trait. You know, the ones that are actually based on the type of soldiers tend to be very good, and they actually cost a little bit more to get them. But then also there are random traits too that cost less, and you can stack them, and it can just individualize the effectiveness of your officers. And I love random elements to the game, and part of that is because I just love the narrative. And so the randomness of like ending up with an officer that happens to be a sharpshooter, you know, just may change the way you employ strategy and tactics for your scenario. Sometimes it won't work. I mean, they'll be diametrically opposed and won't even make sense together. But other times it works out perfectly. And I just like the fact that you're constantly just creating this story in the game. And so I actually love that. I guess I just mentioned that it's not a perfect game. In my mind, I don't think there is actually a perfect game. This game is really, really well done in my opinion as far as the rules, but I do think actually it's deserving of an update. Studio Tomahawk, very much closely named after its first game, which was Muskets and Tomahawks, was made famous by its creation of Saga. It made Muskets and Tomahawks prior to that. I believe it might have released its English version much later than the French version, but during that time period, it came out with Saga, which became extremely popular, and I hear is an excellent game. I think that the book itself could actually have some, like just some edits and just some clarifications. There have been facts that have been produced. It'd be great to have a nice color hardcover book that's to replace the one that's in primarily black and white that we currently have. There would be little things like I'm not going to probably go into the individual ones here, but there are a couple of things that I think would be nice to clarify and have updated in the rules. But I think in my opinion, it's an excellent game, and it's worthy sort of a second edition, or at least some sort of an update. Now I know there are a number of folks on the forums for Studio Tomahawk that disagree because whenever this comes up they say it's perfect the way it is, it doesn't need an update. I kind of disagree. I think in order to continue to support a game, build community around it, it's best to continue occasionally updating it, even if it's just a little bit. And in this case, the quality of the materials, and the fact that it's card based. I mean, I'm sure many people would and the only way you can get these cards is to buy the rule book. A lot of people wouldn't mind even an update on their cards probably. And so from that perspective, I really hope that they do update it. I know that to Studio Tomahawk's credit, they haven't completely abandoned it. When they have they're producing lots of games, the latest one being Congo, and when they show Facebook posts of their conventions and things that they do, they most often do have some sort of Musket and Tomahawk game going on. So it's not like an abandoned rule set completely. I really give this one high marks. I mean, if on a 5-point scale, I'd give it a 5 out of 5. I think it's excellent for all the reasons that I just said. And I guess with that said, that is why I like Musket and Tomahawks. Take care.